So I welcome everyone to the second day of the SARC Federation of Oncology International Cancer Conference. We'll start with the first session without wasting any time. I'll start with the first session. This session is sponsored by MSD Pharmaceuticals. Our speaker is none other than Dr. Amit Rautan, medical oncologist from Bangalore. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Kashish. Good afternoon, everyone. I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity, and I also thank MST. So what we will be discussing quickly in the next 20 minutes is the Keynote 024 data, the 5-year overall survival with the ESMO 2020 update. Now, we know the background outcome of stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer extremely poor. We've hardly see patients surviving 5 years. I can say from my experience, last 20 years being in medical oncology, I can count my patients which I have crossed 5 years. And those are those rare ones. So we hardly see patients crossing. Usually survival is median survivals last somewhere around a year for stage 4 disease in the chemotherapy era, except for those lucky ones who end up with a targeted approach. They are the ones who do well. The rest of them will always progress, move on to second line chemotherapy and succumb in a few years. So it's the 5-year survival stage 4 non-molecular driven cancer has been somewhere about 5 to 10%. Now, we had seen data from the Keynote 024 study already, and it had shown there is a clear benefit in terms of progression-free survival and overall survival. What we'll be doing is running through the study again and seeing what endpoints we've seen at 5 years now. But there were some added things looked at 5 years. Not only did we see the results of the intent to treat population, but there was also patients who completed 2 years of therapy, what happened to them, and also some patients received further treatment with pembrolizumab at progression and what happened to them. So these are the 3 updates we have seen in the 2020 ESMO, which we will be discussing. This was the background of the Keynote 024 study. It is looking at stage 4 non-small cell lung cancers, those who do not have an EGFR and ALK mutation. The PDL1 status has to be TPS greater than 50%. Now, this is a Pembro study, so the antibody is going to be a DACO22C3. And with that, when the TPS is greater than 50%, patients were randomized using pembrolizumab as single agent versus the platinum doublet, which we would do as standard of care for 4 to 6 cycles. The platinum doublet could be a platinum with a histology-driven rupture. It could be pemetrexed-based or taxane-based or even gemcitabine-based. Here, pembrolizumab was given for at 200 mg flat dosing for 35 cycles for 2 years. In the platinum doublet chemo after 4 to 6 cycles, patients who progressed were allowed to cross over to pembrolizumab for 2 years. Now, there were some patients with brain metastasis which were included in the study, but there were no untreated brain metastasis. The primary endpoint of this study was looking at progression-free survival. The key secondary endpoint was overall survival, and the other endpoints were looking at overall response rate, progression, the PFS by the investigators, and the duration of response. Now, seeing the patient disposition, there were 305 patients randomized in this study. 154 received pembrolizumab monotherapy. The other 151 received platinum-based chemotherapy. Now, there were about 83 patients who, after progression on the chemotherapy, who went on to receive pembrolizumab. And there were also 16 patients who received some other form of anti-PD-1 therapy at progression. So about 66% of patients actually received immunotherapy in the comparator arm also. So that's about 66% is the crossover in this study. And in the pembrolizumab, about 51% of patients received a subsequent line of chemotherapy. Now, there were 12 patients in this who actually were retreated with pembrolizumab. And so this is also a very interesting subgroup which was looked at in this study. The time of data cutoff is 5 years now, about 59.9 months, and this is the time this analysis was presented. If you look at the patient characteristics, about squamous cell formed about 18 to 19% of patients. The rest of them were adenocarcinomas, and about 96% of patients were smokers previously. And about 11% of patients in the pembro arm had received previous brain therapy for metastasis. So if you look at the results, this is the results we have seen this year. We had seen these curves quite many times in the last 3 years, but now is the 5-year data which was presented. What we see here, the median overall survival, 13.4 months for chemotherapy, median overall survival almost doubling to 26.3 months with pembrolizumab. And this is very significant. You're talking of a stage 4 patient and you're treating them with just single agent immunotherapy, and you're talking of medians crossing more than 2 years. So that's 26.3 months median overall survival pembrolizumab. But also what we see, these curves, the separation is maintained with time. We saw the 3-year data, we saw the 4-year data. In 5 years, what we are seeing now, 16% of patients with chemo are surviving, 31% of patients with pembro arms are surviving at 5 years. And this is very significant. I told you in the beginning, we spoke about 5-year overall survival being about 5%. Now we are seeing, even in the chemo arm, they're getting about 16%. And this is because they're getting chemo, and many of these patients are getting immunotherapy subsequently. But when you start with immunotherapy directly with pembrolizumab first line, you're talking about 31% of patients having a 5-year overall survival. So very, very significant. This result is really has become practice changing already, but now with this longer data also establishes that fact that we have a clear overall survival importance. If you look at progression-free survival, again, there's a clear significant improvement in PFS, 5.5 months with chemo versus 7.7 months. This with the hazards of 0.5. Now, this is what happens when you treat with immuno. There are few patients who are going to drop off and progress very rapidly. But once those patients who respond can have a long-term response, and that is what we see. We're getting a plateau of the curve there. With time, the patients who did not progress are kind of holding on. And you see, even at 5 years, there's a clear difference between the PFS, between the chemo and the pembrolizumab. Objective responses, with chemo, you had a response rate about 31%, and with pembro, it's about 46%, but about 4% of patients had a complete remission with using pembrolizumab. What is very interesting is the duration of response. Those patients who respond have a very sustained response, and this is what you see. Chemo gives you response, but then you end up losing the response very rapidly, and in 6 months, that was the duration of response for patients with chemo who responded. But if you look at pembrolizumab, you're seeing a duration of response of 29 months. And this is the whole fascination of immunotherapy. Once the immune system is activated, it kind of remains activated, and the disease remains under control for a long time. This was a swimmer's plot presented. This is looking at patients who actually finished the whole therapy of 2 years without progression. So there were 39 patients in the pembrolizumab who finished the whole 2 years of pembrolizumab. That's 35 cycles. And they looked at these patients specifically. The 3-year overall survival for this group was about 81%. If you look at objective responses, about 82% objective response. 10 patients had a complete response in this group. So what we see here is clearly, this is a group who has clearly, the immunotherapy has worked very well. And once it works, the response is very sustained for a long time. Now, this is another small group which was looked at. It was for patients who received pembrolizumab for 2 years, did well, and then because the trial was for 2 years, you stopped the pembrolizumab. And once they stopped pembrolizumab, with time, if they progressed, they were retreated with pembrolizumab again. They were not offered chemotherapy. They were given just immunotherapy again with pembro. And these 12 patients were looked at. Again, it shows that there is an objective response of about 33% in this group of patients when they are retreated with pembrolizumab, again showing that there is a population who responds to immunotherapy again, even after finishing the 2 years when they progress. Adverse events, we've seen that chemotherapy always has a higher toxicity, immunotherapy much lesser toxicity, 90% AEs, but if you look at grade 3 to 5 AEs, chemotherapy had about 53% grade 3 to 5 AEs versus 30% with pembrolizumab. Serious AEs were seen in 22% of patients in the pembrolizumab arm. 13% of patients had discontinuation due to the adverse events in the pembrolizumab arm. But if you see side effects leading to death, it's about only 1.3% in the pembrolizumab arm. And specifically, we are always worried of the immune-related adverse events, which we talk about. there were 34% of patients in the Pembro arm who had immune-related adverse events, but grade 3 to 5 was only 13%. And this is what we have seen in most of our immuno trials. About 10 to 13% patients will have some grade 3 to 5 adverse event. But any of these leading to death was less than 1% in this Pembro trial. And that's again very significant. So we worry about IRAs. We need to be very watchful. But IRAs leading to death was less than 1% in this study. They again looked at what happens to these patients who actually completed the 2 years, that 39 patients. So when you go for extended therapy with the pembrolizumab, does your toxicity vary? And again, we see the same thing. The toxicity actually does not increase. Grade 3 to 5 events were only 15%. But if you look at immune-related events, though 30% AEs as it was in the previous group of patients, but 3 to 5 grade was only about 7%. And again, no deaths due to long-term use of pembrolizumab. So clearly telling us, if you use pembrolizumab, even long-term usage, it is very safe and the toxicities don't go up. And we know this even from using IO agents now over time. So with this was how the study was summarized. With a 5-year follow-up, pembrolizumab continues to show meaningful improvements in overall survival and durable responses versus chemotherapy in KEYNOTE-024 study. Despite a 66% crossover rate, the 5-year overall survival was doubled in the Pembro arm, 31% versus 16%, and the duration of response was 29 months in the Pembro arm. Patients who completed the 2 years of Pembro experienced long-term overall survival. And also a second course of Pembro at the time of disease progression was feasible, and there was anti-tumor activity even when that was done. Incidence of any grade and grade 3 to 5 tumors adverse events was lower with pembrolizumab versus chemotherapy. And long-term treatment with pembrolizumab again showed that there is no increase in toxicity with no new safety signals. This is the first phase 3 study to demonstrate a 5-year efficacy of first-line immunotherapy, and it is a very effective first-line therapy for patients with non-small cell cancer, TPS greater than 50%. Now, this results is almost the same as what we had seen with the KEYNOTE-001 study, which was the first study. It was a single-arm study which had shown that pembrolizumab, when given for these patients with high TPS, more than 50%, 5-year survival was reaching more than 30%. So this again corroborated this evidence through a phase 3 manner. So where does this lead to in clinical practice? I think there is absolutely no controversy. For patients, non-small cell lung cancer, adenosquamous, once we rule out the targeted molecular mutations, of course, this was doing only EGFR and ALK. In the present era, I would say EGFR ALK cross definitely has to be ruled out. Of course, we look for other mutations also, but at least if we have ruled out EGFR ALK cross, we do not have these. If our TPS is greater than 50%, single agent pembrolizumab is the way to go forward. Absolutely no doubt in my mind. Secondly, people could say that what happens if you give chemo and then they progress and then give immuno? They should still respond. But again, what you're seeing here, in spite of having 66% crossover, the overall survival is clearly maintained, making more sense to use the drug upfront rather than keep the drug as a reserve for future. You'll have a lot of patients who will drop out, who may not benefit, who may not be able to take it later, and you will lose these patients. So clearly, as a first-line therapy, I would confidently say we should be using pembrolizumab as single agent is definitely approved. The question always will come, would we want to look at other data sets and say, should we combine chemo with immuno? And again, this is another debate of which patients we should use chemo immuno as first line. But for this population, single agent pembrolizumab is clearly effective, and having a 5-year overall survival of 30% is very, very significant. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll now move on to the next session. This is the academic session 6. It's a joint SFO and the Asian Oncology Society session. The topic is current controversies in the management of metastatic HSPC. Our moderator is Dr. Randeep Singh, medical oncologist from Gurugram. His panelists are Dr. Vikas Talreja, medical oncologist from Kanpur, Dr. Ashwin Rajbhog, medical oncologist from Pune, Dr. Amit Rautan, medical oncologist from Bangalore, and Dr. Amit Verma, molecular oncologist from Delhi. Over to you, sir.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you, sir.
All right, thank you, Kashish, and a very warm welcome to all the experts available with us today to discuss about HSPC. I think this is a field which has really evolved and it is bit sorted out now as compared to what it was in 2 to 2.5 years before, when there was a lot of confusion about treating with a combination or a single agent hormone therapy. And the other beauty of this part, and to be discussed in the panel, is that how it is further evolving uh, in metastatic hormone sensitive prostate cancer setting. So let us start with a case. A 56-year-old man with controlled hypertension and diabetes, diagnosed with symptoms of LUTS and back pain. On DRE, it is a hard to firm prostate. Gleason is 4 plus 4. PSA is 140. A PSMA PET CT was done, which was suggestive of more than 5 bony mets involving vertebra, iliac bone, and clavicle, with few PSMA avid iliac and para-aortic lymph nodes. Largest size of the lymph node is 1.3 centimeter. He was started on ADT leuprolide by the urologist and has been sent for the opinion of a medical oncologist after 2 weeks of starting ADT. So, Vikas, how would you like to treat this patient?
Wonderful case, a very common case, sir. And my preference would be, since there are not much any visceral mets right now, ADT has already been started right now. Keeping ADT alone would be the least preferred option. Using docetaxel would be the next least preferred option because he's not in a visceral mets right now. Epilutamide
You start with your most preferred option rather.
So most preferred option for me would
Okay.
be sequencing, starting with enzalutamide and probably or an abiraterone, since he doesn't have any contraindications of using steroids. Preference would be enzalutamide. Second would be abiraterone for him.
Okay. And you would not like to start him on docetaxel? Any particular reason?
Sir, we have a good number of data. It is a good. I believe the visceral disease is not there. He's not symptomatic. I reserve my chemos only for those who are high volume or visceral disease.
This is a high volume by the charted classification.
I know, sir, but then symptoms and I tend to classify the high volume not as per the trial criteria, but I per se as per the symptom criteria.
Amit, how do you decide? Same case, and I have mentioned some factors which Vikas was alluding to.
So,
Amit Prathan, sorry. Yes, I have. There are two Amits, so I have mentioned the name particularly as per. Yes.
Thank you, Randeep. So this is a situation where you always have a dilemma. You kind of could go through the chemotherapy way, or you could go the abiraterone way or the hormonal way. But I always have a dialogue with my patient in this situation. I try to explain to them pros and cons. I like using chemotherapy with docetaxel in my patients for many of these situations because it is 6 cycles and you end treatment. And then you can keep them in observation and you don't need a continuous treatment. But there are always patients who say, no, they don't want any toxicity of chemo. And those are patients where I will straight away, so I would offer either abiraterone or enzalutamide. These days, I do much more of abiraterone because of cost. And that's one thing I would favor. So I think you would need, as the factors you have put in, you would need to balance these. And after talking to your patient about the pros and cons of each approach, but this patient could fit in for both these ways. My personal choice, docetaxel, 6 cycles, because it finishes at some duration.
Perfectly. I think if I have to summarize the discussion, this never ends and all the options are right. Vikas is right and you are right. And I think a lot of part is played by the patient, as you rightly said, because he has the right to choose when the efficacy is fine. And he has the right to choose that how much he wants, whether he wants for 6 months or whether he wants to be the oral tablet. Many times the question also comes in my practice, and it comes in a couple of who are private practitioners, is about reimbursement, that the oral tablets are not reimbursed. And Amit made a very good point that if you are of the believer, and there is a data to believe that if you are using abiraterone 250 mg, then definitely that cost is quite competitive and quite affordable for the Indian population. Amit, how would you like to treat? We have always been discussing high volume, and there is a lot of the confusion is quite cleared in high volume. as it can be summarized in 2 or 3 sentences. But how do you treat a low volume metastatic disease? I mean, let us presume it is a oligometastatic, same patient, same scenario, 3 metastases, all in the spine, no extraaxial sweat, no nodes. So it fits classically into a low volume oligometastatic prostate.
So that's one place where so the therapy medically is clearly we go the hormonal way. So it is abiraterone with prednisolone, but that's a place where we always are talking nowadays to integrate local radiation to our patients. And we have done it for few of our patients. I know it's very controversial and there's a lot of proponents against it and for it, but looking at the Stampede data and looking at sometimes these situations, I kind of think it is advisable to talk to your patients about radiation to the prostate. So that's what I do to my patients in my low volume setting.
And you would cover only prostate, or you would cover the 3 oligometastatic bone sites also?
No, we will only cover the prostate.
You cover nodes or not. I know this is slightly beyond the discussion of a medical oncologist, but yes,
So we are.
I don't know. Primarily, I leave it to the radiation oncologist. I definitely refer when it is oligo.
Yes, you're right. I think we cover only the prostate.
Only to the prostate.
Only
Can you come again? Sorry, there was some voice.
Okay. Right. We don't touch the bone.
Anyone else would like to comment among the panelists? Anyone for this?
Sir, my preference would be
because anyone can make a comment on
only for the symptomatic side. So he has a LUTS, probably the prostate would symptomatically benefit him. If the skeletal mets are symptomatic, definitely then for it. Otherwise, for the LUTS, probably symptomatic. And that's what probably the rest of the time, the systemic therapy will take care, and he would have a good quality of life with it.
Okay, I agree, but we have to remember that when in oligometastatic disease, the radiotherapy has been added to the local site plus minus stereotaxy to the oligometastatic sites. One of the aim of this addition is to delay the starting of ADT. So I know Amit and Vikas, I do agree partly with them that they would like to add ADT, but one of the aim in all these phase 2 trials have been to delay the initiation of ADT. So we have to keep that in mind. And I would avoid giving ADT if I am giving radiotherapy to the prostate and bones in an oligometastatic site. That is my take, but I know this is all under clinical trial and experimental. It is just phase 2 and phase 3 trials are there. And we do expect radiation oncologists, colleagues and experts to add to this discussion, but I think we don't have any radiation oncologist in this panel. If there are no further comments on this topic, I would proceed further. So Nikhil, Dr. Nikhil?
Sir, Dr. Nikhil has not logged in.
Achha, okay. We have Ashwin, can you take this question also? Suppose you think of deciding, or the patient thinks to decide that yes, cost is not a concern, and I would like to not take chemotherapy as Vikas mentioned, and you are also open to the idea to give AB or ENZA to the patient high risk HSPC. How do you choose between AB and ENZA? Especially cost is not a concern for
them. Well, I'm audible, right?
Yes, you are audible, Ashwin.
Yeah, regarding this patient being a young patient with no other comorbidities, I would choose between abiraterone initially to begin with, and then later on put on enzalutamide when it fails to abiraterone. That would be my choice.
Okay. I will not touch on that point because we want to restrict the discussion to HSPC. But yes, you would like to start with AB and sequence it with ENZA if required in the subsequent lines.
Yes. Subsequent line, yes.
And if this patient would have been elderly, I mean, what is your cutoff of age for AB or ENZA? I mean, if there are no comorbidities, how comfortable are you to start AB for a 65 or a 70-year-old man?
For a 65 or 75, still I would, with no comorbidities as diabetes or such, I would still go ahead with abiraterone, maybe a dose reduction, which data is there of 250 milligrams. So I would prefer that. Later on, I would go ahead with ENZA.
Okay, so you would like to start AB as a preference, and ENZA you would like to reserve because you believe that AB to ENZA sequence is better, if in case you are pushed to do that sequencing. Okay, fine. Thank you. Point well taken. I think I missed. And this was also for you. Would you like to, let's forget about sequencing and push everything together. Let's finish this discussion of giving docetaxel or abiraterone or Enza and combine everything. ADT plus dosi plus Enza. And we know that the data comes from the ENZAMET trial, where in around 25% of the patients had received docetaxel. These were all high risk, high volume, and then subsequently they were put on Enza. And these are the graphs and curves where you can see that there was, with docetaxel, there was a PFS advantage, hazard ratio 0.5, OS advantage lost. Without docetaxel, there was a very good PFS advantage of 0.34 and a good hazard ratio of 0.53 in OS. So would you like to do this sequencing in any of your patient? I mean, ADT plus dosi plus Enza in HSPC setting upfront. Nikhil, Ashwin, sorry.
As of today, though, I would wait basically for the.
Okay. Amit, any thought?
So ENZAMET is showing us. So this was slightly different because only some population of patients were taken who had already been on docetaxel and then added to it. But it showed there was no advantage to it. I don't know. I don't think we'll do everything together.
Advantage,
but
PFS or OS. So how do you define that advantage? PFS or OS? PFS advantage was there, as I showed you in this.
I know, it's very, very tricky. So actually there's a clear trial going on which is looking at this. So I think that will be very interesting to see. But my question to you, Randeep, is this. So if you started docetaxel and you gave 6 cycles only with your ADT and your PSA did not normalize post 6 cycles, what would you do? Would you follow and continue your tablets and put them now on abiraterone or no? This is a struggle I have in clinical practice.
I would wait and see, because whenever we decide in prostate, I mean, that is a basic teaching, and it is not that we forget, but we go with the trials. You always go with the symptomatic, PSA and radiological. So I would at that point see that if he is asymptomatic, he has no radiological progression, even if some disease is remaining, and his PSA has reduced, maybe it has not become less than 2, let us presume, or less than 1 or 0.2, but it has reduced from maybe 70, 80 to 510, I would observe. And whenever he progress, I would put him. But yes, if someone has actually received no response to docetaxel, in that setting, this data will be helpful to put them on directly enzalutamide. I mean, absolutely, it is. PSA has from 70 gone down to only 50, and still on the PSMA or on the bone scan, there are many lesions being picked up. There's a significant residual volume of disease. I think no point in waiting when you are expecting him to progress within 3 months or 4 months.
Right, okay.
So, Amit, I think we have some time. Yes, Amit, role of somatic mutations and sequencing, or even upfront, Amit Verma. Amit, how do you use, we all know, I will just put this slide, we all know these are the current mutations which came to my mind, and I think these are, you can definitely add. I think the first one which goes most important for us is, in today's era, is repair genes, followed by AR gene amplification, though there is controversial data both sides how to use this. And then there are some other mutations coming in like P10, RB1, and of course MSI status is missing on this slide. So in an HSPC setting, how would you like to use the somatic mutations?
So thank you, Randeep, for the question. And for the HSPC setting, we would like to, and you have categorically asked somatic mutations. So normally I refer, or I prefer the somatic mutation analysis at the time of CRPC, not at the time of HSPC. That is my personal take home. But if you're talking about the genetic, that is the germline mutation, which never changes throughout the lifetime. So that can be offered at this juncture. We are not going to change any treatment at all. So whatever information what we have right now, it is for the futuristic thing. So in the HSPC, somatic mutation is not a good way to go forward. But BRCA1, BRCA2, as well as the ATM and other HRR genes should be done at the germline level to be prepared for the PARP inhibitor for the future. And in terms of the other data, which you can see the P10 deletion, recent data has come up for the ipatasertib, the AKT inhibitor in the metastatic setting, but that is limited to the CRPC setting actually, not for the HSPC. P53 mutation, on the other hand, have just a prognostication implication. In terms of the AR genes, that is the ARV7 mutation, is applicable to predict why the patient is not responding to enzalutamide or specifically other hormonal agent. In that case, you have the option of using darolutamide, which is again agent which is better than enzalutamide and can overcome the ARV7 resistance mechanism. So that can be used, but among all the genetic alterations what we have mentioned over here, there is no immediate clinical implication in terms of treatment management actually.
And do you really use ARV7 assay? Because now you have seen that the house is completely divided of in an upfront setting whether to use DOSI or Abi-Enza.
So theoretically, we should use it to find out whether the patient will really respond to this enzalutamide or not. But it is not an easy test, not easily available in India. It is a costly affair actually. So it is better to give a trial of enzalutamide because the probability of having ARV7 is less than 10%. And what we know that while on treatment, the patient develop ARV7 alteration. It is an acquired mutation most of the time. It is not a de novo mutation. So if you use it beforehand, you may not get the answer. But if the patient is not responding to enzalutamide, what you expect, then yes, definitely it is worth it to see whether you want to continue for some more time or you want to change it to the chemotherapy. In that juncture, yes, it may be helpful actually.
Actually, Amit, I was going through the literature a month before, and there is a very controversial data about ARV7 also. Most of the trials earlier, like we used to think that they will give us an answer of deciding between using chemo versus Abi-Enza or darolutamide. But as far as we are not very sure that if you have an ARV7 amplification, then one drug may work better than the other. If you want to add anything else, and as you have already said, it is not easily available, and even the data is also not very, very supportive that this is the answer to decide between chemo versus Abi-Enza.
So I think we are just, it's evolving right now, the data is evolving, and I don't have any expert comment on this. I have come across few of my patients having ARV alterations in the past when I did the genomic profiling. It is not a common alteration what we discuss in the papers actually. It is not that common. So I will withhold my comments till we have some more data on it actually.
Okay, thank you. So I think we will proceed further. Amit, how do you like to sequence? We have already discussed a part of it. Post Enzamet, Arches, Charted. How do you sequence your HSPC patient? Partly it was discussed when we were talking about pushing a patient to everything together, which usually none of us do. And we still believe that prostate is a slow disease. But I have realized, and you will agree with me, that prostate in itself has changed over the last 8-10 years. Not about the trials, but you have started following them and seeing it much more aggressive. How do you decide your sequencing once you have opted for either an Enzamet approach or a charted approach? And these are the trials which we know where the sequencing, these are the trials. And the left-hand side is the data after GETEC. GETEC was, we all know, a HSPC setting where chemotherapy was used, predominantly low risk. And on the right-hand side are the sequence of therapies after Enzamet, I believe. Yes, after Enzamet.
Right. So for us, if we practice in starting docetaxel first and then patients progress, we do use one hormonal therapy. I am not really too much into Enza versus abiraterone, though I know the debates are there and some people believe this is better first and some believe no. But I'm pretty comfortable in there. I talk more in toxicity, cost. Yes, if there's only thing I am worried about is if there is seizure potential, then I would avoid enzalutamide. But otherwise, I'm actually happy doing any one of them. We talk about cost mainly because this is long-term therapy, and that kind of ends up making the decision because they have to take it for a long time. So most of my patients get abiraterone, And then when they progress on abiraterone, then I would go to cabazitaxel. That's where the whole controversy arises, whether we should choose a second hormonal immediately after progression of the first hormonal. And that's where we don't, when we get onto the CRPC setting, we don't usually follow 2 hormonals subsequently. I go into cabazitaxel. But as Dr. Amit has mentioned, that's where the whole space of doing the somatic testing comes in, and looking for PARPs comes into place. I think this is the way we take it further.
Okay, fine. So let's come to the last, the flavor of the talk. COVID era practice, Vikas, and then Amit and Ashwin. Have you changed or will change after the experiences from COVID or your past experiences in the last 6 months? Would you like to change anything? And I think this is actually now apt. We have changed our practice and we have learned. I think we can take Vikas first and then Amit Verma and then Ashwin.
Definitely, the new normal is to put them on tablets, less hospital visits, more of domiciliary, less of complications. So chemotherapy, again, I said that it would be sequenced much later as a reserve option only for those with a symptomatic or progressing disease. And I also tend to the Enzamet was done pre-COVID era, so the Enzamet can't be done in COVID era because they tend to have more frequent visits, and definitely lung is an issue for me. And definitely second thing that I would be saying that Enzamet is preferred over the abiraterone for me because no steroids. So that again helps me with it.
Okay. Amit, you at your center, have you realized anything for HSPC setting in last 6 months, or you would like to take from that message from the tumor board and
yeah, so we, as of now, we are offering germline testing for all the patients, all comers at the time of metastasis. We try to consult them as early as possible because we want to limit the interaction and we want to be prepared for the future. And that is the one take-home point. And we try to reserve the somatic mutation analysis for the future, especially at the CRPC status. And we try to avoid the biopsy if possible in the COVID times, and we try to go for the liquid biopsy. So there's an additional thing where you can still pick up some alterations on the liquid biopsy. And you have now, last year in August, Foundation 1 have got the approval for pan tumor on liquid biopsy to pick up the HRR genes, which are relevant in the somatic mutation, you can say, for your decision making. So these are 2 take-home points actually: avoiding biopsies if possible, and doing germline as early as possible.
Thank you. And Ashwin? Dr. Ashwin?
Well, I would also say the same thing regarding the combination with docetaxel, avoiding most of the hospital admissions, frequent hospital visits, and putting them more on oral therapy. Whenever required, if ADT alone, especially in elderly patients and low disease burden, can be given, we can delay the addition of any adjuvant treatment. And yes, as per the dilemma between abiraterone and enzalutamide, I don't see any much of difference. So I would definitely go ahead with any of those, even if abiraterone has steroids in it.
Thank you. I think thanks to all the experts. So I think this field will definitely expand further. What matters to my mind are these factors: comorbidities, patient preference, and in this order, duration of therapy, OS data, how the oncologist is comfortable. Someone may not have the experience with Enza, or someone may have very bad experiences with docetaxel, febrile neutropenia, serious side effects, and they may not be ever able to counsel, because I always believe that once the oncologist is not confident about one therapy, he will never be able to make his patients also confident whatsoever the way it may be going on. Reimbursement, finances, and definitely another factor which has been added to our life is COVID and non-COVID era. So I would like to congratulate all the organizers, and thanks to all the organizers, Govind Babu sir and Dr. Amit for having me here, and thanks to all the experts.
Thank you so much, Randeep sir, and thank you to all the panelists. We'll move on to the next session. This session is a joint SFO and an ACOS session. The topic is TKIS and the heart. And our moderator is the ACOS Honorary Secretary, Dr. Vivek Agarwal, medical oncologist from Kolkata. His panelists are Dr. Seela Sawant, internal medicine specialist, Mumbai, Dr. Hollis D'Souza, medical oncologist, Mumbai, Dr. Arman Reza, radiation oncologist, Bangladesh, Dr. Sheilendra Shakia, cardiologist from Nepal, Dr. Senthil Rajappa, medical oncologist from Hyderabad, and Dr. Hisham Ahmed, cardiologist from Kochi. Over to you, Vivek, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Kashish. And I thank the organizers, especially Dr. Govind Babu sir and Dr. Amit Bhatt for putting up this wonderful discussion and wonderful conference. And Asian Cardio-Oncology Society is really happy to collaborate with SFO to take this session forward. So today we are going to discuss on the cardiovascular effects of TKIs, and I have a wonderful panel of oncologists and cardiologists here with us. So going ahead with the discussion. So there are 52 FDA approved TKIs and small molecular inhibitors now, which are FDA approved, and the number is going to increase. And if you look at the reported cardiotoxicities, so 27%, that is 14 of them don't have reported cardiotoxicity, but 38 of them, that is 70%, have various cardiotoxicities up to 10 to 20% incidence being reported. So the list of TKIs having cardiotoxicities are going to increase, and we are learning by the day of the newer cardiotoxicities and how to manage them. And if you look at the different TKIs, so we have the TKIs being used in the lung cancers. We have the BCR-ABL TKIs in CML. We have the newer Bruton tyrosine kinase inhibitors for used in lymphomas and CLL. We have the BRAF TKIs, the MEK TKIs, and the classical VEGF TKIs. So I think in the next 30 minutes, it is not possible for us to discuss all the TKIs, and we will concentrate on the VEGF TKIs as well as the BCR-ABL TKIs and try to find out some differences. So our main motto is going to be try to bring out some simple take-home messages regarding these TKIs and not to take on very complex discussion. So just to start the discussion, I would take a case of RCC so as to start. So let us consider this case, a 60-year-old male patient who had a history of right-sided radical nephrectomy being done for a clear cell renal cell carcinoma 4 years ago. And this patient has then been a known case of diabetes and hypertension, which is well controlled on amlodipine 5 mg once daily and metformin. His creatinine is 0.9 and with a good GFR. And now he is diagnosed with bilateral lung metastasis as well as bone metastasis. If you do the risk stratification, it comes out as good risk and he has a good PS. So just to take the discussion forward, Dr. Senthil, how will you proceed with the pre-treatment cardiac evaluation of this patient? Will you do cardiac evaluation for all patients or not? And when will you want to refer to a cardiologist? For all patients, or will you select your patients?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Vivek, for asking me this question. I think the first step is to find out a cardiologist who is interested in doing this evaluation, because that's a rarity. So I think the first step is to get a good cardiologist. It is important to make sure that you are testing all the necessary pre-treatment parameters before you put this patient on a TKI. Since it's good risk, putting this patient on a VEGF TKI is one of the options. I think the evaluation should start from the history, starting from the age, the sex, the comorbidities that are there. You've already listed diabetes and hypertension. We'd also like to know whether this gentleman is obese or not, or is there a history of smoking? What about the lipid profile? So all these things are mandatory to be done, because all this will have a bearing on the likelihood of this patient having a cardiac event while on the VEGF TKI. I think from a specific cardiac standpoint, apart from all these blood tests that we would do, we would certainly do an electrocardiogram and also do at least a 2D echo to make sure that the baseline status is available and he's fit enough to go on the TKI. Regarding cardiology referral or not, I don't send all patients for a full cardiac evaluation. Patients who have many of these risk factors are patients that I refer for a full cardiac evaluation. But otherwise, let's say somebody is 40 years, no comorbidities, not obese, all the blood workup is absolutely fine from a cardiac standpoint. Echo ECG is normal. I routinely don't send them for a cardiac evaluation.
Thank you, Dr. Senthil. I think, sir, you banged upon the issue, and probably you are not sending everybody is because again you answered that there are a lack of dedicated cardio-oncologists who would actually be interested in taking up this issue. And I'm sure with such kind of discussion going forward in future, we are looking at cardio-oncology clinics being there in most cancer centers. Also, sir, you really pointed out on various issues that actually needs to be looked into before we start onto the treatment, right from cardiac history to examination and multiple investigations. And I think we would all agree that sitting in a clinic, in a busy oncology clinic, it is sometimes very difficult to really look onto all these factors. So, it is not a bad idea to have a cardio-oncologist in your team where, you refer to them and to make sure that they tell you about the cardiac risks or not. So, Dr. Hollis, are you there?
Yes, sir.
So, Dr. Hollis, will you wait for the cardiology workup to be completed before you proceed with the treatment, or you do start the treatment while you can always look at the results at your next follow-up? So, suppose the patient is symptomatic, he is having a bit of chest pain or maybe breathlessness. So, what is your take? I mean, do you really want to wait for, or it is okay for you to start?
Sir, the basic workup that even Dr. Senthil has mentioned, that the clinical history, the physical examination, ECG and 2D echo, those can be done in most of the setups within a day before we start the treatment. Echo with the GLS, specifically, we need dedicated cardiologists for that. And especially one thing that I wanted to find out is the BNP testing. The NT-proBNP testing is not routinely available at most centers. We have to outsource it. So if the patient is very symptomatic, at least an ECG or 2D echo before starting, and definitely I will wait for the baseline test for the starting of the treatment, not necessarily for a complete cardiology profile. Prefer to have a complete cardiology profile, but if the patient is symptomatic, I might not wait for it.
Correct. So we really pointed out that it is preferable that you complete the cardiology workup, and it can be promptly done in most centers, within a day or so. So you don't really have to wait long, but starting anti-cancer treatment is also important. So Dr. Arman, we are doing a cardiac evaluation, but does it really affect the choice of TKI? So you have multiple choices. I mean, let us leave out the immunotherapy options, but you have the option of starting pazopanib, sunitinib, axitinib, and all these are FDA approved in first lines. So does it really affect the choice of TKI, the cardiac evaluation and the results?
Thank you, sir. Actually, VEGFR TKI associated. Am I audible clearly?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Please go on, sir.
Actually, this VEGFR TKI associated cardiovascular disease was previously very much underdiagnosed. But especially, I can say that in my country era, still this topic is not so familiar with oncologists, these TKI-related cardiac issues. But here I should say that with the formation of this Asian Cardio-Oncology Society, we are actually people learning, and we are also started thinking in different way. So definitely, if you want to know, want the straight answer, definitely the cardiac evaluation definitely affect in my choice of TKI, because we know that some of TKI causes, because this patient has pre-existing hypertension. So after evaluation, according to the result of the evaluation, maybe the choice of TKI may be changed in this situation.
Okay. Dr. Senthil, what is your take on it? I mean, does it really matter which TKI will you choose based on the cardiac results and the evaluation?
I first choose the TKI, Vivek, and then see if the heart is good enough for the patient to go on that particular TKI. I don't go the other way around. So we don't do a cardiac evaluation first and then choose the TKI afterwards. So that's the way I would do it.
I mean, suppose the patient is a known case of hypertension, diabetes, normal creatinine. So if you have to choose the TKI, which one will you prefer?
I think it's fine to use whatever TKI you want, but make sure you're monitoring it properly, because depending upon the TKI, the incidence of hypertension or a renal issue can be more or less. So it's important to choose the right drug and make sure you're monitoring it properly, because if you're monitoring and you pick up early signs of whatever dysfunction you're looking for, then I think it's important to change your drug. But I think it's important to choose the best drug for the patient.
Correct. So, sir, clearly, I think we can take this message home that whatever TKI you choose, it's okay. But the important part is monitoring. Whatever TKI, it shouldn't, the cardiac status shouldn't affect the choice of TKI, but the monitoring is more important. Okay, Dr. Sheila. So, Dr. Senthil mentioned, a lot of investigations that you and Dr. Hollis did mention about GLS and the biomarkers. So, what is your opinion? Do you want to add to any further baseline investigations, and would you want to do GLS monitoring and biomarker monitoring for this patient? This patient is planned for starting pazopanib, and now the oncologist has sent to you for a baseline cardiac evaluation.
So Dr. Senthil has nicely given an overview of what investigations is to be done, and I am in total agreement with that. Good clinical history and the checking out what the comorbidities are, getting a baseline ECG done, the 2D echo in this patient, especially with the age being 60 and being hypertensive, a lipid profile too would suffice. There is not much data actually for GLS, routine use of GLS and biomarkers as of now. So I wouldn't really recommend that at this point of time. We should wait for more data.
Okay. Dr. Hisham.
Hi, Vivek. Hi.
Yeah.
I apologize for joining late. There were some unforeseen circumstances. Pleasure to be here.
We are really happy that you could join, sir. So anyways, so whenever we approach any patient for baseline cardiovascular risk stratification, so what is the general approach, and in general and in particular for this patient, how would you approach to really classify them based on their cardiovascular risk, and having the risk of any cardiac event?
So yes. So thank you. So I think the cardiovascular risk stratification, I think will be along very traditional and very classical lines of risk stratification of cardiovascular disease. And I think it begins from a thorough cardiac history in terms of has there been any history of cardiovascular illness, details of any previous cardiovascular disease, especially within the context of oncology, any history regarding the oncology therapy received, chemotherapy received, or the type of therapy received. And of course, a thorough clinical interrogation of the cardiovascular risk factors, such as diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, coexistent smoking, and other patient-related lifestyle factors which can contribute to cardiovascular disease. And of course, in terms of obtaining certain objective parameters, blood pressure, the HbA1c, the cholesterol profile, will all add to the risk stratification in terms of the patient profile that we're discussing. So this is very traditional cardiovascular risk stratification, as one would do in a patient in whom you would like to elicit the cardiovascular risk. And of course, this being a higher risk subset because of oncology background, they would need a thorough interrogation of this as well. And of course, in certain subsets, we would choose to perhaps do a baseline cardiac troponin or an NT-proBNP, and of course, a basic ECG and an echocardiogram. And I think, as one of the panelists rightly mentioned, there might not be real evidence in terms of routine biomarker strategy for risk stratification, but there are certain instances and certain case clinical scenarios in which that would be helpful. So where do we have a reference for these recommendations for basic cardiovascular risk stratification? So we have an ESC recommendation now from the European Society of Cardiology for patients who are getting vascular endothelial growth factor inhibitors. And the scoring system is available online, and the system takes into account basic clinical characteristics like previous cardiovascular disease, cardiomyomarkers, if available, demographic risk factors such as age, hypertension, diabetes, and hyperlipidemia, and of course, history of previous cardiotoxic therapy. And this all adds to a scoring system in which you can score the patient from high, medium, high, and very high, and that can aid your clinical decision making. Across the Atlantic, the American Heart Association has certain guidelines, again, which is freely available online, in which they consider certain subsets at higher risk for cardiovascular toxicity. So if they have received high-dose anthracycline previously, high-dose radiotherapy, or if at all they have low-dose anthracycline in combination with HER or VEGF or proteasomes or BCR-ABL agents, they are also considered to be high risk. So in summary, I think a basic clinical risk stratification, and you can use the scores which are available online.
Yeah, I think Dr. Hisham, you have been really elaborate on this and you really banged the answer. Dr. Shilendra, are you there, sir?
Yes.
Yeah. So Dr. Shilendra, what is your opinion on cardiology referral as well as the GLS and the cardiac troponins? So Dr. Hisham mentioned that there are certain patients in which they can refer. So would you do it for your high-risk patients or would you want to do it for all? What is your strategy, sir?
Currently, what I'm doing is if I see any factors like from the traditional risk factors like age above 60 years, and if they have obesity, they have a history of hypertension with diabetes, or they have shortness of breath or chest pain, or even family history. If all of these come out, then I do a thorough investigation that includes a 2D echo and an ECG, but and a cholesterol level. But I don't do GLS on all the patients receiving TKI. I'm currently only doing it for patients receiving adriamycin because of time constraints. I don't have anybody else doing the GLS here, so it takes a little bit longer time. As for the cardiac markers, I haven't done that yet. Only post chemotherapy, if they develop some kind of pleural effusion or if it is features suggestive of heart failure, then I want to do the NT-proBNP to confirm whether it is really due to heart failure or not. In that case, I repeat echocardiogram and the NT-proBNP and guide the treatment likewise.
Yeah, so really some practical points from Dr. Shilendra Shakya there. And I think everybody discussed regarding this baseline cardiovascular risk assessment and checklist. And Dr. Hisham did mention regarding the AHA guidelines of going beyond the traditional only 2D echo and left ventricular ejection fraction to a comprehensive cardio-oncological evaluation that would include all of these that mentioned. And the ESC 2020 paper just mentioned that we should do a prompt evaluation and should not delay the starting cardiac anti-cancer treatment. And the ESC recommendation does give us some scoring system, just as what Dr. Hisham mentioned, based on the different risk factors as to which patient is a very high risk for cardiovascular toxicity and which one is low risk and which one is medium risk. And according to the risk stratification, we can base our future monitoring, and probably for the highest risk patient, we can include a GLS or a cardiac biomarkers in our practice. So there are, the most of the guidelines do cover all these what we have discussed. So continuing with the patient, this patient had a normal baseline cardiovascular workup, and it was high risk because the patient was already having dyslipidemia, already having hypertension and diabetes, already having a single kidney. So this patient was started on pazopanib 800 milligram once daily, standard treatment. So Dr. Hollis, how would you want to follow up this patient as regards to the cardiovascular toxicities and events?
Sir, I would like to see him the first 15 days after the 15 days of starting pazopanib. Although some of my colleagues will prefer to see him after a month, but I would want to see him after 15 days with the blood pressure diary. I ask all my patients to maintain a BP diary. At least for the first 1 week, I ask them to take blood pressure twice a day. And after the second week, I ask them to take it at least once a day.
Okay. And when you are following up at 2 weeks time, Hollis, what are the investigations again that you would want to do?
Yeah, sir, I would do a CBC a same profile, an ECG. I won't repeat a 2D echo. And the other thing that I have seen in my patients after the first month is the rising proteinuria. So I get a urine RM and a 24-hour urine protein also at baseline done. And not at the at 2 weeks follow-up, but at least at the 1 month follow-up, I repeat a urine RM or a 24-hour urine protein also.
Okay, okay.
I do an ECG and a lipid profile.
And ECG, is there anything specific that you want to look at, Hollis? Anything want to document in the ECG?
Look for the QTC prolongation only.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think well said, Hollis. I think you described it very nicely. Dr. Arman, what are the cardiotoxicities that you are really expecting and looking for in this patient down the course of the treatment?
So regarding pazopanib, I should say that the patient should be perfectly monitored about the hypertension, because it has some propensity to because it's a pre-existing hypertension, as well as I think pazopanib has some effect on left ventricular systolic dysfunction. So we should monitor the ECG as well as the echo 2D. Already Dr. Hollis perfectly mentioned about the investigations, what should we do. So one thing is, as because patient has this pre-existing hypertension, so we should monitor the hypertension, and another thing is for left ventricular systolic dysfunction, we should monitor.
Correct, correct. So, Dr. Hisham, it is very important to understand the mechanisms of this VEGFR-related cardiotoxicities, because how to manage would actually depend upon what are the mechanisms and the differences between the different TKIs as regard to cardiovascular toxicities. Also, we can understand. So just briefly, outline the basic mechanism why there is hypertension and why do we have cardiovascular dysfunction. Dr. Hisham, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me, Vivek?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Please go on.
So this is very important. So we know that in terms of prevalence, the hypertensive response is the most common response in terms, if you look at the overall prevalence of a cardiovascular effect of VEGF TKIs. And of course, it's related to vascular endothelial growth factor mediated modifications in the vascular tone. So essentially, we know that in our circulatory system, there's always a balance between vasoconstrictor systems and vasodilator systems. And what VEGF TKIs does is that it sort of tips the balance into it tips the balance towards vasoconstriction. And essentially, we're talking about pathways which are mediated by nitric oxide, prostacyclins, which are essentially vasodilators, and we have endothelins, which are essentially vasoconstrictors. So it tips the balance essentially because of the VEGF-related vascular tone pathways. It tips the balance towards vasoconstriction. So I think that's one of the main models which have been studied for the hypertensive response. So in terms of fall in LV ejection fraction, I think there has been a postulate in terms of a direct myocardial involvement mediated by mitochondrial dysfunction, difference and influence of these drugs on the cellular energetic pathways like AMP kinase inhibition, etc. There has also been an interesting hypothesis in which VEGF TKIs may cause microvascular occlusion, leading to microcirculatory ischemia, again, leading to adverse cardiovascular event profile. And of course, at the end, and as one of the panelists has rightly pointed out, QTC prolongation in terms of on the ECG, on surface ECG, has also been documented. And this is again because of adverse interaction of the ionic channels, which mediates the action potential current in the myocardium. So these would be the basic mechanisms with VEGF TKI.
Yeah. So I think Dr. Hisham, you correctly mentioned, and because the balance is shifted towards vasoconstriction, we have to use vasodilators, in order to correct the hypertension, and these mechanisms really tell us why the non-specific broad TKIs have more of cardiac dysfunction and the specific TKIs, they have less of these cardiovascular toxicities. So going ahead with the hypertension, Dr. Senthil, so what do you feel about the hypertension and the cardiovascular toxicities? Do you think these are toxicities which are due to prolonged exposure to TKI, or you do expect these toxicities to come early in the course of your treatment? And what do you feel regarding the monitoring, and when should you see the patient? How frequently should you see the patient for these cardiovascular toxicities?
I think Hollis clearly mentioned that, Vivek. Let me reiterate that. So exactly like what Hollis said, we would call them back on day 15 because the incidence of most of these cardiac events are very early during the course of treatment, though rarely they can occur late. The vascular events actually can occur a little late, but the elevated blood pressure and all these things are usually very, the QTC prolongation is another thing which happens very early. So we will ask them to maintain their blood pressures, to start with 2 blood pressures every day and note it down, if possible twice a day and note it down. If it usually doesn't go up by the first month, then the likelihood is very less. Then we would ask them to do it twice a week, let's say, and then over time probably go down on the frequency of blood pressure monitoring. ECG at day 15, and then I do one after a month. If all is well, then it's only every 3 months that I do an echo and an ECG for patients on a TKI. One thing that we haven't mentioned during the course is deep vein thrombus is something that I've seen on and off with these patients who are on a VEGF TKI. So that's something that I've seen happening a little late. So that's one side effect that one has to keep looking for every time you see this patient. So the short answer is that all of these occur very early. So you have to keep your eyes and ears open during the first couple of weeks. If they don't happen early, the likelihood is less, not zero.
Yeah. Dr. Arman, coming to you, so there are different TKIs, and which ones have higher incidence of hypertension and heart failure, and which ones has low? I mean, there are so many TKIs. So can you just enlist, the ones which have a higher incidence and ones which have a lower incidence?
So 5 minutes left, sir.
Yeah.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, Dr. Arman.
Okay. So regarding cardiovascular toxicity, sunitinib, it has a great propensity for early development of cardiotoxicity. So I think it has a great propensity. And other than sunitinib, I think sorafenib and also the pazopanib have the cardiovascular risk development propensity. And regarding hypertension, I think lenvatinib, it has a great propensity for development of hypertension.
Correct. So lenvatinib, regorafenib and exitinib, these are the ones which actually came out in the meta-analysis to have highest incidence of hypertension. And so far as heart failure is concerned, actually pazopanib, sunitinib, sorafenib, these ones, the ones which had the highest incidence, with the asymptomatic left ventricular dysfunction being seen almost in up to 10% of the patients. And there is an interesting risk stratification that patients who had a higher age, higher BMI, and a pre-existing hypertension were seen to have a more risk. So, Dr. Sheila, talking about the blood pressure actually monitoring. So there is a lot of issue regarding white coat hypertension, and when you are measuring the BP in the clinic, a lot of patients would tell you that the BP is elevated in the clinic, probably it is normal at home. And then there are ways of looking at ambulatory blood pressure. There are ways of defining as masked hypertension. So how would you really want to them to measure the BP, and how much would you rely on the BP in the clinic or at the home? How would you really know that they are hypertensive?
Yeah, so a good resting BP is what is required. Definitely, the white coat issue of white coat hypertension exists. So, as rightly pointed out by the earlier speakers, these patients are asked to do home monitoring of blood pressure. So, blood pressure can be easily, luckily, blood pressure can be easily monitored with a digital instrument which is available, a good quality one, which by maintaining the blood pressure twice a day, if an average of the blood pressure readings is say 130/85, then that is considered significant. The other option is ambulatory BP monitoring, but again, that is not feasible and possible in all patients. A more practical thing is to get use the digital instrument and ask the patients to maintain a diary and taking the resting BP at home. And for that, an average value of 130/85 in a otherwise normotensive patient, average value of 130/85 is considered significant.
Yeah, Dr. Shilendra, so if you look at the cardiac routine guidelines for hypertension, they are different, and when it comes to oncology, defining hypertension is probably different. So would you really tell us in oncology what would be the cutoff that would actually keep for defining hypertension, and what should be the target BP in these when the patients are on these agents?
Well, according to our ACC, we try to keep the blood pressure around 120/80 or less.
Yeah, so that is for the normal patients, but in oncology, how would you define it?
Exactly. In oncology, the problem we face is that because once they start on the drug and they start increase, their hypertension starts increasing. And then again, there are periods in between when they are drug free. There are some gaps in between the treatment. And I have even had patients who required 5 antihypertensives while they were on TKI. I think he was on sunitinib. And then when the sunitinib was stopped, and then the patient went into shock. So we had to resuscitate him. And then once he was started on another drug, he was started on pazopanib, I think. And then the blood pressure started rising. So I had to do that again. So I don't become too conservative regarding the ideal blood pressure. So I try to stick to somewhere around 140 and 90, anywhere around that or lower than that.
Correct. So as per the CTCAE guidelines, actually define blood pressure, whenever it's more than 140 by 90, then probably we'll start defining hypertension in oncology. But below that, we think that the patient is normotensive. And a very important thing that Dr. Shilendra mentioned, that in sunitinib off period, sometimes there can be a shock also because the blood pressure really drops down on these antihypertensives. And this is also something that we need to warn our patients on treatment, that during the off period of sunitinib, they need to monitor it with the antihypertensives on. So Dr. Sheila, again, Dr. Shilendra was mentioning regarding using multiple drugs to handle the hypertension. So what are the drugs that you would use for managing hypertension in these patients? How would you approach the hypertension management?
Yeah, so these patients, the drugs preferable of choice would probably be the ACE inhibitors and ARVs. We could also use the calcium channel blockers. Only the non-hydropyridine calcium channel blockers like verapamil, diltiazem, that is an issue because they have interactions and that could cause toxicities with the VEGF. Diuretics could be an issue because we are concerned about dyselectrolytemia. We do not want dyselectrolytemia, especially that these drugs can predispose to QTc prolongation. So depending on the severity of hypertension, we could require 1 or 2 drugs, and we titrate it as per the blood pressure monitor.
Dr. Senthil, supposedly...
sorry to interrupt you. So can I request you to conclude? And
yes,
we also have 3 questions.
So just 2 minutes. Dr. Senthil, supposedly this patient recorded a blood pressure of 180/100 on follow-up. So how would you approach? Would you stop the drug, or or would you continue adding antihypertensives, or when would you consider stopping the drug actually because of these cardiovascular issues?
So I would stop if somebody has a blood pressure that is, let's say, 160, 120 by, the diastolic is 120 or something of that sort, a grade 3, grade 4 hypertension. Or if somebody is continuing to have elevated blood pressures in spite of using multiple drugs, that's a situation where I would stop the drug, maybe want to change or reassess if we are, not controlling certain risk factors properly, because let's say diet, exercise and things like that, which we routinely advise all of these patients to do. If they're not doing this, look at aggravating factors and try to control them. So that's when I would really stop. Otherwise, mild elevations in blood pressure, I would not.
So just to emphasize, Dr. Senthil just mentioned about exercise, and exercise is really important as one of the major ways to control blood pressures. And also salt sensitivity is also something that is seen with these TKIs, and they are very salt sensitive. So if we go on a salt restriction, again, this is also one of the important ways as to control the blood pressure. And just as Dr. Senthil mentioned, in case of any hypertensive urgencies or emergencies, we need to stop the drug and maybe change to others, if there is, and of course, if there is any heart failure or decline. So I think with this, I would stop the discussion here. There was so much more that we could have discussed regarding the TKIs, and the time is always less. But I think we had really good messages so far as we can take home as to clear monitoring about the different VEGF TKIs, as well as how to manage the hypertension with the TKIs. So with this, I would conclude the session, and I would hand it back to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vivek. We have 3 questions in the chat box, so I would ask you to just direct it to our panelists. The first question is, should I be alarmed with rheumatic heart disease in my patients about to start TKI?
So, Dr. Hisham, can you please take this question?
Yeah, so I think the quick answer would be no. So it would also depend on what the severity of valvular heart disease that we're talking about. For example, if we're talking about severe valvular heart disease with a rheumatic etiology, let's say we have severe valvular heart disease and there's compromised LV function or severe pulmonary artery hypertension, that's a subset which I would be worried about. But I think if it's mild to intermediate degree of valvular heart disease, there's no significant pulmonary artery hypertension, preserved by ventricular function, I would not be worried.
Thank you so much. There's one more question. We do ECGs almost on routine basis. This is one by Dr. Amish Vora. A majority of patients have non-specific or non-significant changes, but the ECG is not normal. So should we leave it at that if the echo is normal, or any other test should be done, like pro-BNP or TROPI or something?
Yeah, Dr. Sheila, why don't you take this question, and followed by Dr. Shakya to comment?
Yeah, so that the ECG changes have to be correlated clearly. Sorry. That depending on what the changes are, it doesn't, that you have a ECG change and echo is normal doesn't merit that you have to do this biomarkers or even GLS.
Yeah, Dr. Shilendra, non-specific ECG changes and normal echo. So would you leave it at that, or would you, go on to monitor the ECGs beyond the QTC? What do you feel?
Depends on the risk factors. What kind of risk factors are we talking about? If the patient has classical risk factors, or there is some kind of suggestive symptoms that they have any cardiac issue, then I would further do some tests, or even do a treadmill or a stress study. But in other cases, like minor interventricular conduction defect or some kind of T-wave abnormality, that I just leave it. But if there is like suggestive or the risk factors, then I think it is worth looking upon. Also depends on whether the patient has had previous chemotherapy with other drugs as well.
Yeah, so I think the answer is correctly as to what is the clinical correlation of those ECG findings, as well as the the echo correlation, and based on the symptomatic status as well as the risk factors of the patient. So we have to take it on that.
Thank you so much. There's one more question by Dr. Amish Vora again. So if the baseline LVEF is 35% and you are about to give a life-saving TKI, so what is the next course of action? Do we do it, or how is we are going to go about it?
Yeah, Dr. Hisham, baseline abnormal left ventricular ejection fraction. So are these TKI contraindicated? With this cardio-oncology discussion and the cardio-oncology support, how do you really approach this?
Yeah, so I think, Vivek, I think the most important terminology in that question was life-saving therapy. So if the LV ejection fraction is 35%, and in terms of the overall therapy and the prognosis of the patient, this is the only option that's in front of us. I think in the first phase, I would optimize the therapy for heart failure with the foundational therapy of heart failure drugs, such as ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, aldosterone antagonists, and of course, ARNI very recently. Optimize the heart failure status as much as we can. And then as a part of a shared decision-making process with the patient and the clinician, initiate the potentially life-saving therapy with close cardiac monitoring. And I think that's the practical thing that we would do.
Yeah. So very correctly said, Dr. Hisham, that the basic premise, the basic aim of cardio-oncology is to continue life-prolonging treatment in the face of cardiological risks with these expert collaboration and discussion between the oncologists and cardiologists. And if you have a good cardio-oncologist in your team, even if your patient's ejection fraction is low, these TKIs are not contraindicated. Of course, your risk stratification will tell you that this is a very high risk patient, and you should be able to actually continue these TKIs because they will add to overall survival benefit with a very good cardio-oncology evaluation, as well as a follow-up, maybe an intensive follow-up with GLS as well as BNPs. And in these TKIs, BNPs is something that is more preferable, more sensitive of detecting early heart toxicities as compared to troponins. And therefore, the correct answer is yes. Even if the heart ejection fraction is low, you should be able to continue these with a proper monitoring and a baseline good cardiac optimization.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Vivek, for an excellent moderation, and thank you all the panelists for the active participation.
Thank
and
you.
Over to you,
It was
Kashish.
really a pleasure. Thank you.
Over to you, Kashish.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll now move on to the next sponsored session. This is sponsored by Roche. Before we move on to the speaker talk, we'll just play a short video from our supporter. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sandeep Goyal, medical oncologist from Mumbai. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, the organizers and Roche. Can you please share my slides?
Sir, the slides are on the screen, sir.
Yeah, and I'm audible clearly?
Yes, sir. You're audible,
Yeah,
sir.
okay.
Clear.
So my role is to discuss about the optimal selection of antibody drug conjugate in breast cancer. And next slide, please. So this beginning of target therapy actually started way back in 1900s when Paul Ehrlich, the chemist, noted German chemist, proposed a magic bullet hypothesis. And he postulated that there are cellular receptors which exist on the cells, and we can have the concept of magic bullet kind of drugs going straight to the intended cellular target. The antibodies can be used as magic bullets, which can identify a target without harming the organism. And we can also attach toxins to these antibodies to deliver them properly and improve the efficacy of these drugs. Next slide, please. And this is the time schema of the different antibody drug conjugates which have happened in the last decade or so, more than that. So in 2000, actually, the first antibody drug conjugate was approved, gemtuzumab for AML. And then in 2011, we had brentuximab vedotin for Hodgkin's lymphoma. Then came 2013, TDM1 for metastatic breast cancer second line. 2017, inotuzumab for ALL. Then 2019, TDM1 was approved for adjuvant HER2 positive early breast cancer, polatuzumab for DLBCL recurrent, trastuzumab deruxtecan for metastatic breast cancer. And in 2020, we've got 3 drugs approved: belantamab for multiple myeloma, enfortumab vedotin for metastatic urothelial carcinoma, and the latest kid on the block, sacituzumab for metastatic triple-negative breast cancer. So you see, so many drugs have come in the especially last 4 to 5 years. So the antibody drug conjugates have played a very important role, and let's see how they behave in the near future. Next slide, please. The challenge of ADC development is not easy, because if you see this slide, it shows that so many new ADCs were tried to be investigated, but the approved ones were only a fraction of these. Next slide. So what are antibody drug conjugates? So we have an antibody which is linked to a linker, and this linker links the antibody to a cytotoxic drug, and this forms the antibody drug conjugate. And the mechanism of action is receptor binding leads to antibody-dependent cell-mediated cytotoxicity. It leads to signaling inhibition, and also it leads to free drug interaction with targets like bystander effect. Next slide, please. Now, the bottom line is that all these three need to be got right, the antibody, the linker, and the cytotoxic drug. So the antibody has to be tumor selective, intact monoclonal antibody. The linker has to be can be either cleavable or non-cleavable, and there's the difference between the two as well, which we'll show in the next few slides. And the cytotoxic drugs can be either tubulin inhibitors like maytansinoids, or the DNA binders, or the topoisomerase inhibitors like camptothecins and anthracyclines. But the bottom line is that all these three need to be got right so as to get an efficacious antibody drug conjugate with least toxicity. Next slide, please. The reason for getting it right is that normally in the center, which you see, it should be a targeted killing of the tumor by the binding of the ADC. However, if there's a linker failure, then there will be more free drug in the circulation, and that leads to increased toxicity. Also, sometimes there's a non-specific uptake and binding of the drug, and that also leads to increased toxicity with the normal cells. So that is why it's very important for us to develop it properly. Next slide. The linkers also generate different catabolites. If you have an uncleavable linker, which is in TDM1, then usually the catabolites are poorly permeable. They do not lyse the membrane, and therefore they have no bystander killing effect. On the other hand, when you have a cleavable linker, the catabolites are cell permeable, and they can elicit a bystander effect as well by efficiently diffusing across the cell membrane. So that can also affect the efficacy. Next slide, please. And the linker stability is also confers improved pharmacokinetics, efficacy, and safety, as shown in this slide. Next slide. So that's why TDM1 is supposed to be more potent than trastuzumab and also retains the HER2 selectivity. Next slide. Now coming on to, so this was in broad about the antibody drug conjugates, but now we can be more specific about TDM1. In the use of TDM1 in breast cancer, both in early as well as metastatic breast cancer. So in early breast cancer, the goal of treatment is cure. And we all know that up to 70% of metastatic breast cancer patients are actually patients of early breast cancer who have relapsed. So if we can improve the cure rates in early breast cancer, then we would have saved a lot of trouble for these patients, and we would have prevented them from getting metastatic, because we know definitely that there's no cure for metastatic breast cancer. Next slide. And also, despite improved outcomes in HER2 positive early breast cancer with trastuzumab, pertuzumab treatment, a significant proportion of patients will still relapse or die within 6 years. And hence, it is important that we still improve our early breast cancer treatment to avoid these complications. Next slide, please. So the KATHERINE study was designed to optimize the outcomes for patients with HER2 positive breast cancer with residual disease. Now, before the KATHERINE study, there was no data available to guide treatment decision based on residual disease after neoadjuvant chemotherapy and target therapy. Because there was no data only, there was no evidence that residual disease can be used as a marker to optimize the treatment. The CREATE-X study in HER2 negative metastatic early breast cancer showed that patients with the residual disease, they benefited with addition of chemotherapy. So the same principle was used in the KATHERINE study, and this was designed to provide evidence for optimizing therapy to TDM1 after patients who have received neoadjuvant chemo and target therapy and have got residual disease after surgery. Next slide, please. So TDM1, we know it's trastuzumab, which is targeting delivery of DM1 to the cell, and also acts by downstream signal inhibition and ADCC. We have got the linker, which prevents the release of DM1 and therefore the reduced toxicity, because if you have more DM1 in the circulation and more toxicity, it prevents the premature release of linker of DM1. And then you have the DM1, which is the chemotherapy, the cytotoxic drug, and the DM1 is internalized by the endocytosis and inhibits the microtubules assembly, leading to apoptosis. So this is what actually TDM1 is. Next slide, please. And this is the schema, the cartoon. Next slide, please. Kazella binding to HER2 receptor, then getting internalized. Next slide, please. Releasing the drug DM1. Next slide, and which acts on the tumor cells. Next slide, please. So capture design was patients with CT1 to T4, N0 to N3, and M0 early breast cancer patients, HER2 positive, who have received neoadjuvant therapy, at least 6 cycles of chemotherapy with at least 9 weeks of taxane, minimum 9 weeks of trastuzumab, dual anti-target therapy allowed, and these patients were then underwent surgery, and patients who had a residual invasive tumor, either in the primary breast tumor or in the lymph nodes, they were randomized to receive either trastuzumab or TDM1 every 3 weeks for 14 cycles. Right. The stratification factors were clinical stage at presentation, inoperable versus operable, hormone receptor status positive, negative, neoadjuvant therapy, whether trastuzumab alone or trastuzumab plus pertuzumab, and the nodal status after surgery, whether it was positive or negative. The primary endpoint was invasive disease-free survival, and the key secondary endpoints were overall survival, the disease-free survival rate, and the safety. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. Yeah. So Catherine met its primary endpoint. So TDM1 reduced the risk of invasive disease survival event by 50% compared to trastuzumab at a median follow-up of 41 months. So you can see that the disease-free survival rate was 88% for TDM1 at 3 years versus 77%. So an absolute benefit of about 11%. Hazard ratio 0.5 and a p-value of less than 0.001. So significant results showing that TDM1 was better than trastuzumab in this setting. Next slide, please. Also noted was that the magnitude of benefit in the invasive disease-free survival rate was consistent across all the patient subgroups, especially the stratification factors. So patients who had operable, inoperable tumors to start with, or who had hormone receptor positive, hormone receptor negative tumors, or who had received trastuzumab alone or trastuzumab plus pertuzumab, all of them had a benefit more than with the TDM1 than trastuzumab alone. Even in lymph node positive or negative patients after surgery, again, the benefit for TDM1 was more than with trastuzumab. Next slide, please. Even in very small tumors of residual disease, that patients who had less than 1 centimeter tumor also of residual disease after surgery, even in those patients, TDM1 should have benefit as compared to trastuzumab. Next slide, please. The majority of recurrences were distant, and they were all as compared to the trastuzumab arm. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. In the secondary endpoints, the disease recurrence-free interval was more. 89% rate was 3-year event-free rate was 89% with TDM1 as compared to 83%. Hazard ratio of 0.6. Next slide. The overall survival data are immature, but they are still supportive of the primary endpoint. They're tending towards supporting that. Next slide, please. Now, this is important. Regarding of the previous anti-HER2 directed therapy, whether the patient received trastuzumab or trastuzumab plus pertuzumab, both these patients had more benefit with TDM1 than with trastuzumab. So, for example, out of the whole study, 80% of patients received trastuzumab alone as neoadjuvant therapy, and about 18% had received trastuzumab plus pertuzumab as neoadjuvant therapy. And in both these populations, you found that the 3-year IDFS was higher in the TDM1 arm as compared to the trastuzumab arm. Next slide, please. Now, coming on to the risk of CNS recurrence. So if both the arms, Herceptin, trastuzumab as well as TDM1, the risk of CNS recurrence was similar, about 5 to 6%. Of note that patients with CNS recurrence as an only event was more common in the TDM1 arm. There's something called competing risk. So when there's a substantial reduction in the risk incidence of extracranial recurrences as the first event, this increases the likelihood of having a serious recurrence as the first event. And therefore, that was more in the TDM1 arm as compared to Herceptin arm. Also noted was that the median time to CNS recurrence was longer in the TDM arm as compared to the trastuzumab arm. Next slide, please. After CNS recurrence also, the OS was similar between the treatment arms. So although more patients had the CNS recurrence, but the overall survival was similar. Next slide, please. The benefit was consistent irrespective of whether the patient received adjuvant radiotherapy or not, whether patients were hormone receptor positive or hormone receptor negative. In spite of that, the benefit was consistent of TDM1 versus trastuzumab. Next slide, please. So in nutshell, KATHERINE met its primary endpoint. It significantly reduced the risk of breast cancer recurrence or death in patient with residual disease after neoadjuvant therapy, either with trastuzumab alone or pertuzumab in comparison with trastuzumab. And the benefit was seen across all the patient subgroups. The toxicity profile will come to next slide, please. So the AE rates with KADCYLA were as expected based on previous trials. Now, of note here in the KATHERINE study, we have to realize that the discontinuation rates due to side effects of TDM1 was way higher, 18%, as compared to trastuzumab, which was only 2%. Next slide, please. But most of these adverse events leading to TDM1 discontinuation were lab abnormalities, which are consistent with the known safety profile. And these lab abnormalities were generally low grade, asymptomatic and reversible, and hence we need not really reduce or discontinue the treatment based on these lab abnormalities in real life practice. Next slide, please. And that's why, all these guidelines, the ASCO, NCCN, CN-Gallen, all of them recommend that if there's residual disease, invasive disease, seen in either the breast tumor or the lymph nodes after neoadjuvant therapy with chemo and target therapy, then one should preferably use TDM1 for 14 cycles as an adjuvant therapy. Next slide, please. This was a summary. We have already discussed that. So it's a new decision point in HER2 positive breast cancer, early breast cancer. We have now changed our outlook of treating breast cancer. We look at the pathological complete response. If there's still residual disease, then we change the drug, as we do in HER2 negative also, we are doing HER2 positive as well. Next slide, please. Now coming on to the role of TDM1 in metastatic breast cancer, we all know we have been using TDM1 in the second line standard of care. Next slide, please. And all the guidelines also recommend that, and this is based on the EMILIA study. Next slide, please. So EMILIA was a phase 3 trial that established KADCYLA or TDM1 as a standard of care for second-line HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer after failure of trastuzumab and chemotherapy. Next slide, please. So this was compared to lepatinib and capecitabine, 1,000-patient study. Next slide, please. And we can see the difference. The median PFS was 9.6 months as compared to 6.4 months for the lepatinib capecitabine arm, hazard ratio of 0.65.